1941, Winchester stopped building the Model 1892. Marlin had already walked away from its own pistol-caliber lever gun several years before that, somewhere in the middle of the Depression. The old cartridges these rifles fed on were fading, sales had gone soft, and when the war arrived, the machinery got pointed at other work. Nobody wrote an obituary. There was no farewell catalog page, no last-run commemorative, no letter to the dealers. An entire category of American rifle just quietly stopped being made. Now look at where we are. Today that same basic rifle is being built by Winchester, by Rossi, by Chiappa, by Henry, by Marlin under Ruger, and by Smith & Wesson. And the single most common chambering across the whole category is a revolver cartridge introduced in 1935. So, here is the question this whole episode is built on. How does a product category die, stay dead for a generation, and then come back so hard that it becomes one of the default recommendations in American gun shops? And here is the strange part. Nobody designed this. No company planned it. There was no marketing meeting where somebody drew this on a whiteboard. At least 4 completely separate groups of Americans built this market. Most of them were not trying to. Most of them never met. Several of them would have had nothing to say to each other in a bar. We are going to walk that chain backwards, one link at a time, and we are going to check every link against the record instead of against the story people tell. Most of the links hold up. One of them, the one you hear repeated most often, turns out to be pointed in the wrong direction entirely. I'm Hank Mercer, and this is GunRank. Start with what actually died, and what it had been for. The pistol-caliber lever gun was never a mystery product. Winchester's Model 1892 and Marlin's Model 1894 both existed to solve a specific problem for a specific person. If you lived a long way from town, you carried a revolver on your hip and a rifle on your saddle. Buying 2 different kinds of ammunition, hauling 2 different kinds of ammunition, and keeping track of 2 different kinds of ammunition was a genuine nuisance. So the industry built rifles that ate what the revolver ate. Farmers bought them. Ranchers bought them. Trappers, surveyors, miners, and more than a few rural peace officers bought them. Winchester alone built something over 1 million Model 1892s. That was not a niche. That was a working tool. And then the reason for it evaporated. Roads got better. Ammunition got easier to find. The cartridges these rifles were chambered for, the 25-20 and 32-20 and 38-40, started sliding out of fashion. Marlin dropped its 1894 in the mid-1930s. Winchester ended the 1892 in 1941. After that, the category existed almost entirely in 3 forms. Guns already in people's hands, guns in collector cases, and guns in movies. That last one matters more than it sounds. The Model 1892 became the rifle you saw on screen, over and over, in hundreds of westerns, because the truly old Winchesters were too scarce and too valuable to hand to a stunt crew. A whole American generation grew up recognizing the silhouette of a rifle nobody was manufacturing anymore. So what brought it back? Here is where almost everybody, including a lot of people who should know better, gets the order wrong. The story you usually hear is that cowboy action shooting revived the pistol-caliber lever gun, that a bunch of folks in costumes rescued a dying platform. Check the dates, and that story falls apart. Because the revival started first, and it did not start with rifles at all. It started with a revolver. In 1955, Smith & Wesson and Remington put the .44 Magnum on the market, and through the 1960s, the big Magnum revolver became one of the loudest cultural objects in American shooting. Handgun hunting turned into a real pursuit rather than a stunt. Magnum revolvers sold, and once a lot of Americans owned a Magnum revolver, that 100-year-old idea came back on its own. 1 cartridge, 2 guns. So in 1969, Marlin brought the Model 1894 back from the dead, chambered in .44 Magnum. In 1976, down in Rio Grande do Sul, a Brazilian company called Amadeo Rossi started building its own copy of the Winchester 1892, and in 1979, Marlin added the chambering. This entire episode is circling. 357 Magnum. Now hold those dates against the other story. Cowboy action shooting did not exist yet. It would not be invented for another 2 years. Its governing body would not be formed for another 8. So we have to retire that claim right here, on the air, because it is not supportable. Cowboy action shooting did not bring the pistol-caliber lever gun back. The pistol-caliber lever gun was already back, and it came back as an accessory to the revolver, which is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. The rifle did not save itself. The handgun saved it. And that leaves an obvious problem, because a comeback is not the same thing as a market. Plenty of products get reintroduced, sell for a few years to the people who were nostalgic for them, and quietly disappear again, once that group is served. Something had to give this rifle a reason to keep selling year after year, to people who did not already own a Magnum revolver. That is where the men in costumes finally come in, and what they actually did is more interesting than the version people repeat. In 1981, a Southern California shooter named Harper Cree spent a rainy Saturday watching old westerns on television. He was a competitive shooter already, and he got an idea that was, on its face, slightly ridiculous. What if we shot the next match with cowboy guns? He called 2 friends. They did it. By April of 1982, there was an organized match with 65 registered shooters. By 1987, the whole thing had a governing body, the Single Action Shooting Society, and it has since issued well over 100,000 memberships and sanctions matches at more than 400 affiliated clubs. Nowhere in that story is anybody trying to save a product category. Harper Cree was not thinking about Marlin's tooling. He wanted to play cowboy on a Saturday. But look at what the rulebook did. To compete in the main match, your rifle has to be chambered in a pistol caliber, roughly 32 through 45. Rifle cartridges are explicitly excluded. The rulebook names the 30-30 by name and shuts the door on it. No box magazines, tube-fed, exposed hammer, barrel over 16 inches. Read that again, because that is not a preference, that is a requirement. Which means every single person who takes up this sport has to buy a pistol caliber lever gun. Not wants to, has to. And then, because it is a timed sport shot in volume, that person burns through ammunition at a rate a deer hunter would find hard to believe. And the most common chambering in the sport? 38 Special, shot out of rifles most commonly chambered for 38 and 357, because it is mild, cheap, and easy to find. A rulebook is not a marketing campaign. A rulebook is closer to a standing purchase order. Now this is exactly the point where a story like this gets oversold, so it is worth slowing down. There is no honest way to say this sport saved the pistol caliber lever gun, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. What the record supports is narrower, and honestly, more useful. Cowboy action shooting created a recurring, rule-driven source of demand for exactly this kind of rifle, in exactly this family of calibers, running continuously from the 1980s forward. It kept the category commercially visible during decades, when almost nothing else was pulling it forward. That is a contribution. It is not a rescue, and the difference matters. Because what a contribution like that buys is something you cannot see from the outside. Think about what it actually takes for a company to keep building an old rifle. You need the tooling. You need the fixtures. You need somebody on the floor who has fitted a toggle link or a locking block before and knows what right feels like. You need a distributor willing to stock it, and a catalog page willing to carry it. All of that decays if it goes unused. Tooling gets scrapped. People retire. Catalog space goes to something that moves. So here is the idea underneath this whole episode. A product category does not have to dominate a market in order to survive it. It only needs enough recurring customers to keep the tooling, the distribution, and the institutional knowledge alive. Look at who was building these rifles through those decades. Rossi kept the 1892 pattern in continuous production in Brazil. Italian makers built reproductions. Winchester, working through the Miroku factory in Japan, brought its historic designs back under the Winchester name, and in 2013 put the Model 1873 back into production. Marlin kept the 1894 going and added Cowboy variants. And in 1996, a new company took the Henry name and started building lever guns in America, with pistol-caliber rifles as the foundation of its centerfire reputation. None of that was a boom. That was a category staying warm. And then, out of a completely different direction, a customer showed up who had never heard of any of this. For decades, big stretches of the American Midwest did not allow rifles for deer at all. If you hunted in southern Michigan, or most of Ohio, or much of Indiana, you hunted with a shotgun slug, or a muzzleloader. That was the deal, largely for reasons of range and safety over flat, populated farm ground. Then that started changing. In 2014, Ohio opened its deer gun season to rifles chambered for straight-walled cartridges, from a minimum of .357 caliber up to a maximum of 50. Michigan opened its shotgun zones the same year. Indiana followed in 2016, Iowa in 2017, West Virginia in 2018, Maryland in 2020, Illinois in 2023. By the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation's count, 10 states added straight-walled rifle cartridges to firearm deer seasons over roughly a decade. Now notice something about where several of those rules drew the floor. .357. Nobody wrote those regulations to help a lever gun. Nobody in those wildlife agencies was thinking about Marlin, or Henry, or a man in Coto de Caza with a rainy afternoon and an idea. They were solving a land use and safety problem in populated farm country. But a rule that says straight-walled, minimum .357 caliber happens to describe a cartridge that had been sitting in production since 1935, in rifles that had been sitting in catalogs the whole time. The door opened, and the product was already standing in the doorway. And that claim needs a fence around it too. These rules vary by state, by season, by zone, and by year, and they get amended more often than people expect. A cartridge legal in one state's gun season may be illegal in the next county over. Check your own current regulations before you build any plan around this. Nothing in this video is legal advice. Which brings us to the genuinely unusual part of this whole thing. Stack up who was buying it by the 2010s. The Cowboy action competitor, buying because a rulebook required it. The Midwest deer hunter, buying because a wildlife agency changed a sentence. The recreational shooter, buying because .38 Special is pleasant and affordable to shoot in volume. The person on acreage, buying because a short carbine is easy to carry and easy to store. The traditionalist, buying because it looks like something his grandfather would recognize. Now here is the thing. Not one of those people needs the same justification as any of the others. That is rare. Most products live or die on a single story. One reason to buy, one customer to convince, and if that story weakens, the product goes with it. This rifle collected 5 unrelated stories, and every one of them pointed at the same rack. That is what makes a boom possible. Not one big trend, several small ones that never had to agree with each other. And then the manufacturers did the last thing that was needed. They stopped asking buyers to choose between nostalgia and usability. For a long time, that was the real tax on owning one of these. You wanted the walnut and the blued steel, fine, but you also got a tube you had to load from the front, no practical way to mount an optic, and iron sights designed for younger eyes. Watch what changed. In 2018, Henry added a side-loading gate to its centerfire lever guns, then built out the X model line with polymer furniture, threaded muzzles, accessory attachment points, and fiber optic sights. Ruger acquired Marlin in 2020, brought the Model 1894 back, and by March of 2025 had a blacked-out dark version of it in .357. Winchester's 1892 is currently cataloged in .357, and in January of 2024, Smith & Wesson introduced the Model 1854, its first lever-action rifle in 170 years, with a forged receiver, a threaded barrel, and a rail on top from the factory. The .357 chambering followed. Sit with that last one for a second. Smith & Wesson is the company that introduced the .357 Magnum in 1935 as a revolver cartridge. 89 years later, the same company walked back into the lever-action market it had left in the 1850s and put that same cartridge in a rifle. That is not nostalgia. Companies do not spend that kind of money on nostalgia. That is a read on where the customers are. So why does all of this feel sudden? Because we are watching the last 5 years of a chain that started more than half a century ago, and every link before this one happened somewhere nobody was looking. 1969, a rifle comes back because of a revolver. 1979, it gets the chambering that will eventually define it. 1981, a man watches westerns on a rainy Saturday. 1987, that turns into a rule book. 1996, a new American manufacturer bets on the category. 2014 through 2023, a dozen state agencies change a sentence about case shape. 2018 onward, the manufacturers finally modernize the thing. Not one of those decisions was made with any of the others in mind. And that is the honest shape of it. What looks like an overnight trend is very often decades of unrelated decisions finally arriving at the same place at the same time. Now, straight talk about what this episode cannot tell you. These links cannot be weighed against each other. Nobody can do it, not from public information. There is no data set that tells you how much of today's demand came from competition shooters versus straight wall hunters versus people who just wanted a handy carbine. Anyone who hands you percentages on that is guessing, and probably selling something. What the record does support is the sequence, and the fact that each of these forces was real, documented, and pulling in the same direction without coordination. Which leaves one last question, and it is the one that actually matters here. Why do some old designs survive when most of them do not? We tend to answer that with the word nostalgia, and that word does a lot of lying for us. Nostalgia is cheap. Nostalgia fills auction catalogs and museum cases. Nostalgia does not keep tooling on a factory floor for 80 years. Look at what actually happened here. This rifle was not rescued once by one group who loved it. It survived because every generation found a completely new reason to keep it useful. The ranch hand needed one cartridge for 2 guns. The Magnum revolver owner wanted a rifle to match. The competitor needed a gun that fit a rule book. The Midwest hunter needed a case shape that fit a statute. The modern buyer wanted something he could put a light and an optic on. 5 reasons. None of them the same. Not one of them nostalgia. I keep coming back to Harper Cray on that rainy Saturday in 1981, calling 2 buddies about a slightly ridiculous idea, with absolutely no notion that anything he did that afternoon would still be moving rifles off shelves 45 years later. That is usually how this works. The people who keep a thing alive rarely know that is what they are doing. Somewhere right now there is a shooting sport nobody takes seriously, or a state agency editing a paragraph, or a small company betting on a design everybody else wrote off. And in 40 years, somebody will call whatever comes of it an overnight success. If you own one of these, tell me in the comments which door you came in through. Competition, hunting regulation, range time, ranch work, or just because you liked the way it looked on the wall. The answers are almost certainly more scattered than anybody expects, and that scatter is the whole story. There is a free companion document for this episode below. It is called The Modern Lever Gun Boom Timeline, and it lays out every date in this video with the event, why it mattered, and where it came from, so you can check the dates yourself instead of taking anyone's word for them. And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe. We do the receipts.